Hey guys, today I'm going to be talking about the history of horror movies and slasher films with a few random, but interesting detours. The history of horror spans over 130 years, originating with tragic plays from ancient Greece and extending to 1896's Le Manoir du Diable, and evolving from Gothic literature adaptations to reflections of common fears. Key eras include the 1930s Universal monsters, 1950s atomic sci-fi, 1970s slashers, and modern horrors. In this video, we will be diving into all of these. Before there were horror movies, there were spoken horror tales, fables handed down from one generation to the next, theatrical presentations made to thrill and horrify audiences. The origins of the horror story may be traced to the beginning of language and theater itself, as far back as 2000 BC and Homer's Odyssey, which could be classed as a horror. 800 BC, the Odyssey involves a variety of contests between mortals and monsters with a strong otherworldly flavor, in which man is but a tool or pawn of the gods. This created fear in people at the time, making them worry about the consequences of upsetting unknown higher powers. Odysseus was on the receiving end of Poseidon's wrath due to an incident in which he blinded the sea god's son, Polyphemus, but better known as the Cyclops. Odysseus then boasted about his so-called victories. This act of defiance and pride, also referred to as hubris, caused Poseidon to persecute Odysseus, destroying his ships and delaying his return to Ithaca for 10 years, leaving Odysseus's wife Penelope in agony with no clue if her husband is dead or alive. Slight detour, but while Odysseus was away from home, his wife Penelope had to deal with many suitors vying to be the next king of Ithaca, wanting to take Odysseus's position as most simply, and understandably, assumed him dead. The suitors spent their days in Odysseus's palace, carelessly eating their food and drinking large amounts of wine, just generally being boisterous and annoying. They leered at Penelope and refused to leave when asked politely. Telemachus, the son of Penelope and Odysseus, tried to kick the men out, to no avail. Penelope was running out of time. She delayed the inevitable by sewing a tapestry every day for 15 years. Each night while the suitors slept, Penelope would undo the entire tapestry that she had spent the whole day working on, meaning that she would have to recreate it the next day, and therefore prolonging the engagement for 1 day more. Anyway, now let's get back on track. The more documented early era of horror films was in the early 1900s, most commonly referred to as the Silent Era. The Silent Era spanned from the 1900s to the 1920s, rooted in German Expressionism. Early films used trick photography and to introduce supernatural, Gothic themes. In silent and melodramatic films, the movies were in black and white. Due to this, female actors had to tweak their makeup. The drastic silent film makeup required unconventional, high-contrast colors to translate properly on camera, often using dark green or blue for lipstick, eyeshadow, and contouring. These, along with yellow grease paint for concealer and foundation, created necessary depth, shadows, and definition, preventing features from appearing flat or washed out under early lighting. The 1930s to 40s was referred to as the Golden Age of Monsters in relation to horror films. Universal Pictures defined the genre with Dracula, 1931, Frankenstein, 1931, and The Mummy, 1932, tapping into Depression-era anxieties. Depression-era horror movies acted as the kind friend who relates to your struggles, though unfortunately can't do anything to really change the situation since they're in the same boat too. This helped audiences that were facing mass poverty, unemployment, and instability, as the movies reflected fears of broken science, the downfall of arrogant elites, and foreign threats. These films provided a safe space to confront anxiety about the future. The monster in these horror films often represented the dangers of tampering with nature or the downfall of the elite, while the era's zombie films portrayed the undead as soulless factory workers, reflecting a fear of dehumanizing labor that many had to struggle through during the Great Depression. Xenophobia is the fear, dislike, or prejudice against people perceived as foreigners or outsiders, often stemming from a perceived conflict between sides. Its origins are the Greek terms for stranger and fear. Certain Depression-era movies featured exotic, foreign, or ancient threats, allowing audiences to displace their anxiety onto external, distant forces. The 1950s and 1960s saw a distinct evolution in horror cinema, heavily influenced by the anxieties of the atomic age, Cold War paranoia, and a shift toward psychological terror. This period transitioned from the rubber monster, creature features of the 1950s to more sophisticated, psychologically grounded horror in the early 1960s. Following World War II, the fear of nuclear annihilation, radiation, war, and failure of science dominated the cultural landscape, heavily influencing horror and sci-fi movies. Films often featured giant, often deformed creatures as metaphors for the destructive power of the atomic bomb. The fear of scientific advancement gone wrong was explored in films like The Fly, 1958, and The Incredible Shrinking Man, 1957. Films then began to develop through a much more psychological approach. The most well-known and notorious age of horror films has to be the 1980s and 90s, best known for the slasher and masked killer films. Horror movies became much more graphic and explicit, examples being The Exorcist, 1973, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974, and Friday the 13th, 1980. There became a thing such as the final girl trope in horror movies. This was when in a horror movie, a young woman with a normally troubled past manages to outsmart the killer right until the very end, surviving, but with lifelong trauma and PTSD. A great example of this is Sidney Prescott in Scream 1. The subgenre was defined by masked, often supernatural killers stalking teenagers, almost always in groups of 4 or 5, filmed in first-person camera perspectives and including increasingly graphic violence. Found footage, films made an appearance in the 1990s, famous examples being The Blair Witch Project. There was an ironic approach to horror and reality often seen as a reaction to media technology. This style of filmmaking challenged traditional storytelling by presenting fictional narratives as authentic, unedited recordings, bringing the fear of it could be you to horror audiences by making everything feel more real. Modern 2010s, present horror is defined by elevated genre filmmaking, focusing on intimate grief, social commentary, and psychological tension alongside blockbuster scares. The advanced technology allows for better jump scares and more believable violence. That's all I have to say for today. Hope you enjoy.